Hello, and welcome to a re-record of my series on Introduction to C# for Unity developers. In this series of videos, my goal is to teach C# both inside of Unity and outside through a basic console application so that you can see what C# looks like outside of the Unity environment. The purpose of teaching this way is to teach important concepts that newcomers to Unity may not be exposed to, and also try to protect people from learning bad habits. To start us off, I'd like to start outside of Unity entirely and just look at what a basic C# program looks like built from Visual Studio as a console application. Now, if you want to follow along with Rider or Visual Studio Code or any other IDE of your choice, the process should be more or less the same. I'm not going to get into basic use of those IDEs in this video, but there's, I'm sure, plenty of other resources out there for how to use those IDEs instead of Visual Studio. So to begin, I'm going to click on Create a New Project. And in my IDE, I have console application C# at the top of my recent project templates. But this may not be the case for you, so you can use the drop-down options up here to set up the parameters to narrow the search results for your case so that you can find the C# console. But if you type console into the search bar up here, it'll give you a couple by default, such as console app C#, console app Visual Basic, console app C++. I point out these three because we want the first one here, so please be sure to click on the one that starts with C#. I'm going to click on Next. Now here, I'm not too concerned about what we're going to call this. I'm just going to call this Test Console, just to give it a name. I'm going to click on Next. And now, here you have the option to choose a framework. This won't really be important in terms of how this is going to affect us for Unity developers. I'm going to mostly cover topics that work within Unity only. So know that in our case, this probably won't matter. I'm going to explicitly avoid .NET 7 things, for instance, that takes us beyond the scope of the lesson. What I would like to point out, however, is this line here, do not use top-level statements. Now, the first time we run through this, I'm going to keep this off because I want to show you what happens when we do this, because you otherwise might not know that this is what a valid C# program may look like if you've never seen minimal C# before. Okay, and now we're in our IDE in a new project called Test Console. And here we have 2 lines of code, and only 2 lines of code. This is a fairly modern way that you can work in C#. This comment up here leads us to Microsoft's page explaining what's going on with this format. Just to demonstrate, I'm going to take that out. I'm going to leave us with one single line here. I'm going to run this application to prove to you that one single line of C# is enough to make a working project. And there we have it. Hello world, printing as one would expect. So the reason Microsoft introduced this format was to get people up and running without having to worry about namespaces, classes, or the main method in their initial basic program. This minimal format only works for program.cs, which is the file that we have open right now. If I were to try to build out a real application from this project so far, all the code that I want to move outside of the main thread, that's the main method, would have to exist in other files, which have to be built out using the more standard C# syntax. So we got to write out our classes, we got to write out our methods. We're going to talk more about how that all works. I just wanted to start with this example to show you that a single line of C# can actually represent a full program in the modern age. And if you come across a script that looks like this, please understand that it is totally valid C#. Okay, and now we're back to opening up Visual Studio one more time. I'm abandoning the project that we just created that was just done as an example here. What I'd like to do is show you how to create a project that looks more conventionally like what we expect from C#, and more importantly, the way that we have to work within Unity. So I'm going to create a new project here. And everything I want is already selected here. I'm just going to click on next. I'm going to call this a proper C# application or console, maybe. I'm going to click on next. And now this time I'm going to click on do not use top level statements. Now, while we're here, I just like to point out, I don't like the wording of this. I don't believe that a Boolean that you can check on or off ought to be for a negative statement here, especially one that people see so often when they're building console applications here. A better wording would be use top level statements, and then the Boolean would do the opposite. Check off to not use top level statements, check on to use top level statements, that sort of thing. While this is loading up, I'm going to take a moment to explain that I was a late comer to accepting this format. I don't really like it when a programming language hides what's going on under the hood for essentially little gain when it comes to new users' experiences. I understand that if you're building a program that doesn't need to do much more than hold on to a main single class and method and execute things top down, that perhaps that shortened format that we were just looking at may actually suit you well. Basically, it's like a simple scripting language. But when you're learning, it's a bad habit, I believe, to use minimal C#, and you should actually look first at what a program really looks like under the hood. No training wheels. So here we're looking at what a most basic scaffolded C# program can look like. And just to prove that it works, I'm going to run this. Although you might imagine that this is going to have no errors off the bat. There we go. Just like last time, it says hello world. And just as a matter of completeness, I want to point out that this program is actually precisely the same as the one we looked at just now. Just now we're not hiding all this stuff, which is actually never going to differ from project to project. Maybe the namespace might change depending on what you call the program. But I'm actually not even going to, that's not even really important right now. I'm actually just going to delete the namespace. In fact, there, this is what our program is going to be. I'm going to run this just to prove to you that deleting that didn't affect anything. Okay, so now I'd just like to go over what we're looking at here in terms of the anatomy of a program. So this first line here, internal class program, we can actually rewrite as public class program. Now, internal and public do mean different things, but this is already getting us a little bit closer to what we see in Unity. Class program refers to a collection of methods and data, which all must be kind of bundled together as a group. Now, in C#, your basic program must have one of these bundles. That's why we have a class here called program. In fact, the program must have a class called program. Even Unity, under the hood, uses a class called program to control its most basic execution at the first at the entry point when the program starts. You don't get to control that though. That's handled by Unity, which is why you wouldn't ever see that. Similarly, there is going to be a method called static void main, which represents the entry point to executable code. So the first line of executable code that does anything meaningful is going to exist within a method that looks exactly like this. And in our example here, that's where console.writeLine happens. Please note that in C#, main must exist within program, but not all programming languages require that all executable code live inside classes. This is actually a C# thing, not totally global to the world of computer science. In fact, you might have heard the word function thrown around out there along with the word method to refer to basically what this sort of thing is. Please know that there is a difference between those two, but in C#, we only really work in methods. There are some very minor exceptions to this rule, which are a fairly advanced topic that we'll get into much later on. But anytime that you see like void, like, and then some word and then your parameters here, in Unity, we're always talking about methods. All methods are functions. The definition of function can be a little bit more broad than that. For example, in some programming languages, we can write what looks like a method out here. And here it's saying that top level statements must precede namespace and type declaration. So in C#, this is not a real place where you're allowed to put that kind of thing. But in some programming languages, you can. And those are distinctly functions, not methods. So I absolutely haven't answered the question as to what is the difference between a function and a method, really. So while this probably won't give you a clear explanation as to what a function is, as opposed to a method, please understand that there is a difference, but in C# it doesn't really matter. So now let's get to extending our program just a little bit. So what I'd like to do is talk about this line, console.writeLine, and then we have this text in here, hello world. Whenever we have text that is delimited by these double quotes here, really what this is doing is storing these words as data. Like, for example, I could write console.writeLine here, and it's clearly not being read as keywords in the C# language because it lives within these double quotes. If I take this away, all of a sudden you can see that the color of the text changes, and now this is the programming language being expressed. So anything that we write within these double quotes is really just handled as text. This text is actually called a string. What I'd like to talk about next is how we can define a new string or a new variable of any kind. So if we type string, and string really means text, and then give it a name such as my variable, and then use the equal sign, I can assign data to this variable. So you think of the variable as a slot where you can place data, and I'm going to place into this slot my message using the double quotes to eliminate a string. And you can see that it's changed color here in my ID and accepted that this is a string. And now if I want to use this somewhere down the road, you can actually see that it's got this green underline here because my ID has decided that this variable isn't being used, so this line doesn't actually have to exist. But we can change that by replacing everything inside of console writeLine with my variable, which gives a reference to the data that we had set to it earlier. So if I save that and run this right away, we now see my message. Again, just so you understand clearly what's going on here, this is the same as if I just wrote this explicitly inside of console.writeLine. Now, I know for some of you this might be very, very basic. I want to start the series off with the most basic approach to learning C# as possible for somebody who is really just getting started on this. But don't worry, we're going to immediately get a little bit more technical by the second video. Probably most of you don't need this first video to get started, but some people will, so that's why it exists. So the last thing I'd like to cover in this video, since we're showing how to print data out to the console, is how to read it. So just as we have a line here, console.writeLine, there exists another method called readLine. Now, readLine requires, or it doesn't require, but you ought to use this line in front of a variable assignment like this, because it's going to ask the user to provide some data, and then we're going to need to store it somewhere. More on that in just a moment here. And now, just so that we have some way to use it, I'm going to hook this back up here. So my variable. Save, and if we run this. Now, it's not printing anything yet because the first thing that we've asked it to do is to take some data in. So I'm going to write, I am writing this message. And when I hit enter, you can see that the very next thing it does is it prints out that message. Now, a quick realization, I just like to point out here, programs execute from top to bottom. The very first line that gets executed is the first line within the main method. And then the last line that's executed is the last line of main. Whoops. The program actually ends when it gets here. This method running out of statements to execute is what signals that the program has finished executing and we've actually just quit the program entirely. I'd also like to, just as a last, and a last thing, point out that if all we have in our program is console.readline, now this will work. There is no obligation to actually pipe our data to a variable. If I run this, it will allow me to type whatever I want. And then when I hit enter, the program ends. Even though it collected the data from us because we didn't assign it somewhere, it doesn't really care what we do with the data. It's collected it, and if we don't use it, that's our choice. So if it's your first time running through a C# program and you try to collect data from the user just to test this for yourself, remember that you must store it somewhere in order for it to be of any use to you. And I think that's a good place to stop for this video. So thank you very much for watching. If you like what I'm doing, please hit the like button. Subscribe to my channel if you want to see more of this content. And I understand how basic this video was, trust me, but I wanted to get it out so that it would simply exist. Anyway, thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.